It was just another ordinary day for John. He was driving home from work, stuck in traffic on the highway. As he sat in his car, he could feel the heat building up around him. The sun was beating down, and he was starting to get a headache. Suddenly, he heard a loud honking sound. He turned to see a car behind him, the driver glaring at him through the rearview mirror. John couldn't understand what he had done wrong. He had been driving safely and following the rules of the road. But the driver behind him was furious. He kept honking and flashing his lights, trying to get John to move out of the way. John could feel his anger rising, but he tried to keep his cool. He didn't want to get into an accident. But the driver behind him wasn't going to back down. He started to swerve around John's car, cutting him off and trying to force him off the road. John could see the driver's face, twisted in rage. He knew that this man was dangerous. As the driver swerved in front of him again, John could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He was trapped, with nowhere to go. He knew that he had to do something to get away from this maniac. He tried to speed up, but the driver behind him was just as fast. He tried to slow down, but the driver was right on his tail, honking and flashing his lights. John could feel his rage building, but he tried to stay calm. He didn't want to stoop to this man's level. But as the driver continued to harass him, John began to lose his cool. He started to swerve, trying to shake the driver off his tail. But it was no use. The driver was too close, too relentless. Suddenly, John's car hit a pothole in the road, and he lost control. His car spun out of control, crashing into the side of the road. He could feel his head spinning, his vision blurry. As he tried to regain his bearings, he saw the driver of the other car getting out of his vehicle. He was walking towards John's car, a sinister smile on his face. John knew that he was in trouble. He tried to open his car door, but it was stuck. He was trapped, with no way out. The driver reached the car and yanked open the door. He grabbed John by the collar, pulling him out of the car. John could feel his grip tightening, his fingers digging into his flesh. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" the driver spat. "Cutting me off like that? Well, now you're going to pay." John could see the madness in the driver's eyes. He knew that this man was going to kill him. He struggled, trying to break free, but it was no use. The driver was too strong. He dragged John to the side of the road, his grip tightening with each step. As they reached the side of the road, John could see the driver's car parked nearby. It was covered in scratches and dents, evidence of the man's violent temper. The driver pushed John against the car, his hands tightening around his throat. John could feel the air leaving his lungs, his vision fading. He knew that this was it. He was going to die at the hands of a madman. But just as he was about to pass out, he heard a loud scream. The driver turned to see what had caused the noise, and John took his chance. He pushed the driver away, scrambling to his feet. He looked around, trying to find his savior. And that's when he saw her. She was a young woman. The driver turned back to John, his eyes filled with rage. But before he could attack again, the woman stepped forward, swinging the rock at the man's head. The driver stumbled back, his grip on John loosening. He fell to the ground, unconscious. John gasped for air, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked up at the woman, grateful for her help. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. The woman nodded, her eyes still fixed on the driver. She walked over to the man, checking to make sure he was still breathing. "He'll be okay," she said, turning back to John. "But we need to get out of here. Who knows when he'll wake up?" John nodded, his mind still reeling from the attack. He followed the woman to her car, grateful for her help. As they drove away from the scene, John couldn't help but wonder who this woman was. He had never seen her before, but he knew that she had saved his life. "Thank you," he said again, turning to her. "I don't know what I would have done without you." The woman smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Just doing my part to keep the roads safe," she said. John nodded, still in shock from the attack. He couldn't believe how quickly things had escalated. One moment, he was just driving home from work. The next, he was fighting for his life against a madman. As they drove in silence, John couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung over him. He knew that he had narrowly escaped a terrible fate, but he couldn't help but wonder if there were more people like the driver out there. More people with a hair-trigger temper, ready to lash out at any moment. He tried to shake the thought from his head, but it lingered there, like a dark cloud. He knew that he would never forget the terror of that moment, the fear that had gripped him as he faced down his attacker. As they pulled up to John's house, he turned to the woman one last time. "Thank you," he said again. "I owe you my life." The woman smiled, her eyes warm. "Just doing what anyone would do," she said. And with that, she drove away, leaving John to ponder the events of the day. As he lay in bed that night, John couldn't shake the feeling that he had narrowly escaped a terrible fate. He knew that he would never forget the terror of that moment, the fear that had gripped him as he faced down his attacker. And he knew that he would always be grateful to the woman who had saved his life. She was a hero, in his eyes, someone who had stepped in when he needed her the most. But even as he drifted off to sleep, John couldn't help but wonder what would happen if he ever found himself in that situation again. Would he be as lucky the next time? Would there be someone there to save him, or would he be left to face the madness alone? The thought filled him with dread, but he knew that he couldn't let it consume him. He had to live his life, to take each day as it came, and hope that he would never have to face such terror again. But in his heart, he knew that the memory of that day would never truly leave him. It would be with him always, a reminder of the dark side of human nature, the rage and violence that lurked just beneath the surface. And he knew that he would never take the safety of but despite his efforts to stay safe, John couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he got in his car, he felt like there was someone out there, waiting to attack him. He tried to tell himself that it was just his imagination, that he was being paranoid. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. One night, as he was driving home from work, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Up ahead, in the distance, he saw a car that looked just like the one that the driver from his earlier attack had been driving. He tried to tell himself that it was just a coincidence, that there were plenty of cars that looked like that one. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it was the same car, the same driver. As he got closer, he saw that the car was indeed the same one. The driver was even wearing the same clothes, a red t-shirt and ripped jeans. John's heart raced as he realized that he was being followed. He tried to speed up, to lose the car behind him, but it stayed right on his tail, swerving dangerously close to his bumper. He knew that he had to do something, that he couldn't just keep driving and hope that the car would go away. So he made a split-second decision, one that he would come to regret for the rest of his life. He pulled over to the side of the road, hoping that the driver would just pass him by. But the car pulled up behind him, blocking him in. John felt a surge of panic as he realized that he was trapped. He tried to turn his car around, to get away, but the driver was too fast. He was already out of his car, walking towards John's vehicle. John reached for his phone, hoping to call for help, but it wasn't there. He had left it at work, charging on his desk. The driver reached John's car, pounding on the window with his fist. John could see the rage in his eyes, the same madness that had fueled his attack weeks before. He tried to stay calm, to reason with the man, but it was no use. The driver was beyond reason, consumed by his own fury. And then, before John could react, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. John screamed as the man lunged at him, the blade glinting in the moonlight. He tried to fight back, to push the man away, but he was too strong. As the man's blade sliced into his flesh, John felt a wave of pain wash over him. He knew that he was going to die, that there was no way out of this. But then, just as he was about to give up, he saw a glimmer of hope. The same woman from before had pulled up beside them, her car screeching to a halt. She jumped out, a tire iron in her hand. With a fierce cry, she charged at the man, swinging the tire iron with all her might. The man stumbled back, dropping the knife. The woman kept swinging, her eyes fixed on the man's head. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the man slumped to the ground, unconscious. John lay there, bleeding and broken, as the woman called for an ambulance. He knew that he was lucky to be alive, that he owed his life to the woman who had saved him twice now. As the ambulance arrived, John couldn't help but wonder how many more people like the driver were out there, waiting to. After several days in the hospital, John was released and he went back to his normal life. But he couldn't forget the horrors he had experienced on the road, and the fear that still lingered in the back of his mind. As he drove to work one morning, he heard a news report on the radio. A man had been arrested for a string of road rage attacks that had left several people injured and one dead. The man had been caught by police after a high-speed chase, and he was currently in custody awaiting trial. John listened to the report in shock, realizing that the man who had attacked him was finally going to face justice. He felt a sense of relief wash over him, knowing that he wouldn't have to live in fear anymore. But then, as he pulled up to a stoplight, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the car next to him, he saw the driver from his earlier attack. He was staring at John, a sinister grin on his face. John froze, unable to move or speak. He felt a wave of panic wash over him, wondering how the driver had gotten out of jail and why he was still following him. But then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the driver sped off, disappearing into the traffic. John sat there, shaking and gasping for breath. He knew that he had to do something, that he couldn't just let the driver keep tormenting him like this. So he went to the police, telling them everything that had happened to him. They listened intently, taking notes and promising to do everything they could to keep him safe. In the weeks that followed, John lived in constant fear, always looking over his shoulder and wondering when the driver would strike again. But he never saw him again, and eventually, he began to relax. Years passed, and John moved on with his life. He got married, had children, and built a successful career. But he never forgot the terror he had experienced on the road, and he always remained vigilant, never taking his safety for granted. And then, one day, he heard a news report that sent shivers down his spine. The driver who had attacked him years before had escaped from prison, and was believed to be on the loose. John felt a wave of panic wash over him, wondering if the driver would come after him again. He tried to stay calm, telling himself that he was safe now, that the police would catch the driver before he could hurt anyone else. But the fear never went away, and John found himself looking over his shoulder once again, wondering if the driver was watching him from the shadows. As the days turned into weeks, John felt like he was losing his mind. He couldn't focus on anything else, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. All he could think about was the driver, and the horrors he had inflicted. And then, one night, as he was driving home from work, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Up ahead, in the distance, he saw a car that looked just like the one that the driver from his earlier attack had been driving. John's heart raced as he realized that he was being followed. He tried to speed up, to lose the car behind him, but it stayed right on his tail, swerving dangerously close to his bumper. He knew that he had to do something, that he couldn't just keep driving and hope that the car would go away. So he made a split-second decision, one that he would come to regret for the rest of his life. He pulled over to the side of the road, hoping that it was the same driver from his earlier attack, his eyes filled with a mad gleam, his lips twisted into a snarl. John felt a surge of fear wash over him, wondering what the driver was going to do to him. He tried to roll up his window, to lock the doors, but it was too late. The driver reached out and smashed his fist through the glass, grabbing at John's throat. John struggled to breathe, his vision growing dim as the driver tightened his grip. Just as John was about to pass out, he heard a sound that made his heart skip a beat. It was the sound of a police siren, growing louder by the second. The driver heard it too, and he let go of John's throat, jumping back into his car and speeding away into the night. John lay there, gasping for breath, his body shaking with fear and relief. He knew that he had narrowly escaped death, that the police had saved his life. But the horror of the experience stayed with him, haunting him for the rest of his days. He never forgot the driver's face, his cold, merciless eyes, his twisted grin. And he knew that he could never let his guard down again, that he had to be vigilant, always watching for the next attack. For John, the road was no longer a place of freedom and adventure. It was a place of danger and terror, a place where the monsters of the world roamed freely, waiting for their next victim. And he knew that he could never escape that reality, that he would always be haunted by the memory of that one fateful encounter on the road.